The blue in your sports drink. The blue in your kids' lollies. The blue in that butterfly pea latte. There's a very good chance it came from petroleum. Not a plant, not a berry, not even a synthetic approximation of something found in nature, but petroleum. And here's the thing. Almost nobody in the food system is talking about that. Today, two investors who noticed and backed the alternative. Mark Gustowski is the managing partner of Mandalay Venture Partners, a Brisbane-based agri-food technology VC firm that has placed 11 bets on where the food system is going to transform. Timothy Hugh is his partner and head of operations, a medical engineer by training, former QUT commercialisation lead and co-founder of both Mandalay and its sister fund Tundra. Between them, they've backed a company turning spirulina into a natural food colour that's replacing petroleum dyes, a company reimagining the genetics of Australian livestock, and another company building the proteins that'll be on plates in 2035. Welcome to Intelligence Optimised. I'm Todd Crowley. Let's get into it. By the end of this conversation, you'll understand something about your food that most people never think to ask. Mark, I want to start with a provocation, not a pitch. You've backed 11 companies across the food system, from inside a cow to inside a restaurant. What's the single biggest thing the food system is doing wrong right now that your portfolio is trying to fix?
Thanks, Todd. And there's a few angles to that question, and I'll probably tackle two of them initially. So across our food systems, one of the things that we are really trying to fix is a fundamental and a systematic lack of capital that actually allows for a lot of the companies in the food system, both upstream, midstream, and downstream, to grow. And by lack of capital, what I mean is that across the whole of the venture capital landscape, less than 2% of investment actually goes into the agriculture, food technology systems at all. And that is quite strange given that it represents about 12 or 13% of Australia's GDP. So one of the issues we are trying to rectify is increasing the amount of capital going into innovations across the food system that allow for the adoption at the consumer end. So that's one of the issues. I think one of the other major issues that we see, particularly across East, Southeast, North Asia and Australia, is the actual nutrition that sits within the food that we eat. And so how do we actually increase the nutritional value, the bioavailability of nutrition, and the growing systems that actually help feed the growing population? And so there are a couple of the challenges that we're actually looking to try and rectify and bring stakeholders across and on board to support those sorts of activities.
And Mark, there's one investment in your portfolio that I want to use as the entry point here because I think it illustrates exactly what you're describing better than any explanation could. And that's FUL Foods, natural blue from spirulina. Walk me through what's actually happening there and why it matters more than it sounds.
Sure. So FUL Foods is actually a very interesting company, Todd. It's an Amsterdam-based company that also has offices over in the US. They've developed technology around the extraction of the functional constituents of spirulina. Now, for those that may not know, spirulina is actually the most nutrient-dense plant on the planet. It's a microalgae or a part of the ocean flora. It is very, very high in protein. It has natural blue and green pigments and coloration, very, very high in antioxidant properties, and has a number of other functional actives that support the human food system. Traditionally, spirulina has been challenging to work with, one because of the smell and one because of the taste. It can smell fishy and oceany, and it can taste similar in a similar way. FUL Foods have actually developed technologies extracting the smell, taste, as well as the functional components like the color, the proteins, hemes, fatty acids, that actually allow you to now increase the availability and the opportunities for spirulina across the food system. A good example of that, Todd, and I think the one that is very, very exciting at the moment is the use of food colorants. So in the US, petrochemical-based food colorants were banned last year with about a 12-month moratorium for very large food manufacturers and food ingredients companies to replace those. Now, if you think of foods like Blue Smarties, Gatorade, cakes, icings, anything else that's blue, predominantly that's come from a petrochemical base, which isn't necessarily great for you. FUL Foods have developed technology around the extraction of the natural blue and green pigments from spirulina. They are now being tested and trialled with a number of the very, very largest food ingredients companies in North America to replace petrochemical-based colorants, which include the blues and the greens. It's quite exciting, the outcomes that they've had to date. I think the banning actually comes in sometime in the next quarter in the US for those petrochemical-based food colorants, and FUL Foods really stands at the front of the line for replacing those petrochemical-based colorants with a natural alternative that's also pH stable and continues to contain all of the functional benefits that having spirulina would normally provide. And so that's a really, really interesting example of what's happening in the food systems at the cutting edge, where things like food colorants come into play.
Tim, I'm going to throw to you on the investment case and the execution of reality here. So you tell me from an operational standpoint, what does a company like FUL Foods building this actually have to solve?
Yeah, I think what is always first to highlight with emerging companies and young companies is execution. And it was impressive from the very first meeting with the company that the three co-founders were not only just really smart in themselves individually, but altogether a force that is like no other. To have such a complementary trio of co-founders who can cover the commercial, the technical, and operational was a real gem of a find from our own angle. So when it looks at FUL Foods, there's probably two major aspects to consider. First piece is the technical, and the second piece is the commercial. And so looking at the technical piece first is not only does it come from extensive science around deep understanding of how to derive or grow the biomass from spirulina and the right strain to use, but also to look at how do you go through the extraction process through to how do you integrate this into an existing supply chain. So how does FUL Foods look at this, and how do we look at this as an investment is we have a limited ability to invest outside of Australia due to our fund structure. But more importantly, with early stage companies, there's a real benefit of having proximity to your portfolio companies. And so FUL Foods breaks all of that. They're based in Amsterdam in the US, when our firm is headquartered out of Brisbane, Australia. And so the way that we look at this is the fact that the investment case is that FUL Foods cannot exist anywhere else in this world. And that's because the biomass needs to be grown in a food-grade closed-loop bioreactor. And they have that facility in the Netherlands, but not here in Australia. And then also the whole supply chain of extraction of the biomass through to the pigment, the fats, the separation, and then the supply chain of co-manufacturing into the end product all sits across the European and UK region. And so the first piece is the technical. More importantly is the company to understand what is the characteristic of the ingredient that they ultimately need the specification to look like. And the investment case for us for FUL Foods was not necessarily just the product, but was the underlying IP to create a water-soluble, pH-stable color pigment from a natural source instead of the nasty petrochemicals that we have in market today. Coming to the commercial piece is FUL Foods had to demonstrate to the market that there was market interest in a natural colorant of blue. And so they actually started with their own beverage, an RTD, which is a bright, beautiful, light blue in color, which draws the attention from across the room. And that demonstration of market applicability really started a journey for FUL Foods to get market adoption as a food ingredient company. And so looking at it is we did not invest in a beverage company, even though that's where the lion's share of activity and revenue came from early on. We're not actually investing in a food ingredient company. The way that we look at this through an investment case is we've invested in the underlying platform technology which creates the future of food.
That's a really methodical process that you go through. But so my mind is still stuck at the fact that you're telling me that every blue sports drink on the shelf right now, every blue Smartie, is derived from oil.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on. Tim, you're the person who doesn't just back companies, but you go inside them. And when Mandalay invests, what does sleeves up actually mean in practice? And what do you walk in and do?
So sleeves up capital for us starts from the very beginning of the journey. Starts from the point of us identifying the gems that most generalist investors cannot see what the underlying magical investment thesis is. So a lot of the time we face startups that when you're a founder and you're in the day-to-day grind building a startup, you're so close to the daily problems. But what you're solving to industry is not necessarily the investment opportunity or the investment proposition. And that's what we end up spending a lot of time on early on, is finding the little gems, incubating them, working with the founders, working with management, working with industry to identify and build the narrative on what is the investment case. And how do we make this an attractive investment proposition, not just an innovative product in market? Then we work with the company itself, working through the identification of strengths, weaknesses, desired talent. How do we make this a well-rounded business? And how do we use our networks to support that? That can happen through capability, can happen through governance, it can happen through commercial. And probably the best example of this is working with a industry partner, what we call venture partner, which is a specialist in our network, to actually go into the company and identify those gaps, but also work out how do we fast track the commercialization journey. And we've done this multiple times where our network or the people who have conducted our technical due diligence for us through our journey have actually ended up working in the business and accelerating the journey of those startups rather than them trying to find who is the right people to speak to as a early stage and young company. Through to what I would highlight is sleeves up capital to us means that we are not afraid to be a lead investor. Now, in the investment world for startups and venture capital, there are a lot of people who lean onto others who are the specialist or are willing to work closely with the company to take lead and draft terms and handhold and be the point person for an investment round. And finding that party can be one of the most challenging things for a startup to identify through the capital raise journey. Because not only are you trying to find a conviction, you're trying to find someone who's willing to put the time in and someone who is willing to put their brand, logo, and reputation behind yours to drag other investors and convince other investors to come into the round as well. And so for us, we pride ourselves on being a thematically focused fund manager who has a deep understanding of the nuances of ag and food technology, who has the industry specialization both on a commercial basis and on a technical basis, who can conduct the due diligence. And also through our lens of having proximity to industry through commercial and our investor base is to be able to build a foresight and a position on where is the market going and what is that long-term thesis that underpins the tailwinds, but also the headwinds against each of our investments that we're about to make. And so that is all the work that we do before we even join the company as a shareholder and investor. Then we talk about the journey ahead, which is to go through the journey of supporting the company through its commercialization journey, being able to support them in getting access to customers, having access to corporate strategic partners, how to negotiate licensing deals and commercial agreements, and distribution. And then, of course, at the very end, what we'd be remiss to not cover is what is the exit, or what is the way that we can support the company in returning capital back to their investors? We purposely designed our firm around the positioning statement of financing the future. And we think that it needs to be disclosed up front that we are ultimately financiers and that there's an expectation of capital to be returned. And so it is on our responsibility as shareholders and as institutional investors to support companies, not only just to put money into the company, but for the return of capital as well. And so what that means is to work with corporates, strategics, private equity firms, and mostly international conglomerates on how do we position companies so that we can create a competitive marketplace for an interest to acquire these companies in the future, which will provide a return not just to us as investors, but also to the founders as well, so they can go out and do what they do best, which is ultimately build great companies.
Yeah, and Mark, from your point of view, what's the contrast between the investment thesis and the operational reality?
So we look at a number of things when we invest in a company. One is the execution capability of the team and how we can actually support the growth of the team, and whether that be with hiring staff, strategic relationships, B2B relationships, corporate engagements, institutional support, other investors. Interestingly, I think one of the statistics that always strikes me is that for every dollar we invest, we bring in about $4.8 from outside, which shows that there's a real need for leadership in the investment category across the space. And so looking at team, technology, defensible moat, which is the patents or the intellectual property associated with that, and then perhaps some early customer traction. Those are the sorts of things that give us some real comfort and validation. On the operations side for a business, we really look to support through identifying the skills required to help grow companies and take them into global markets. So for a number of the investments we've made, we've actually been able to place a number of our venture partners, and Tim talked about the venture partners previously, into the companies that we've invested in to support the strategic growth. Examples of that one would be YieldX, which is a company that has technology in greenhouse growing and the efficient production of increasing greenhouse yield. We actually placed one of our venture partners in there as the chief commercial officer to help grow the strategic relationships and international customer relationships, which has resulted in a number of customers actually coming out of India. And so those are the sorts of things we look to do. So capital is one thing, but expertise, market knowledge, customer knowledge, and strategic relationships is something else that we actually look to bring into the businesses and support them from an operational side. I think there's another great example of that, and a company that we've recently invested in out of Singapore, which actually creates antimicrobial, antifungal, antibacterial additives products that go into things like food wrapping, that extend the shelf life of produce and post-harvest. But that technology is actually derived from cashew nut skin. And so we've actually been supporting, and Tim's been doing a lot of heavy lifting on introducing that company to strategic partners in Australia and also other parts of Asia, to look at supporting growth and expansion into markets, including Australian agriculture, post-harvest, food packaging for shelf life extension. And so I think when any company is actually looking to take capital on from an institution or a venture fund or the like, it's not just the money, but it's what else can they bring to the table that shortens the time frame for you to get to market and increases the likelihood of success.
So the colour story from FUL Foods is one thing. The commercial structures, in backing these companies is another. But I want to go a bit deeper here, because I think there are two other bets in the Mandalay portfolio, aside from those others that you just mentioned as well, that tell us something more confronting about where the food system is heading. Embryo livestock genetics. So most of our audience understand why technology matters in food, but they probably don't understand why this particular bet matters to Australia's strategic position. Help me make that argument if you can. We've been watching the Hormuz Strait closure and its downstream effect on fertilizer and feed inputs. Does that kind of geopolitical event change how you think about the genetics of Australian livestock?
It's a very good question, Todd. It doesn't change how we as Tundra/Mandalay think about the genetics, but it certainly starts to change the mindset of the consumer about the challenges of the food systems, the transport, the lack of diesel, the challenges with fertilizers coming out of the Middle East, and how we actually deal with that. One of the things that we know is becoming increasingly important, and this has very much happened since COVID and is happening again now, is that localized production, whether you're in Australia or in Sri Lanka or in India or the US, is becoming increasingly important. We spend a lot of time in Singapore. Singapore is uniquely challenged in that they actually don't have any cattle at all on the island. And there are any number of reasons for that. Embryo itself is a animal genetics technology company that's developed specific technology applications around the replication of bovine embryos. Now, what does that mean? So normally, when you're producing or rearing various types of cattle, dairy cattle, beef cattle, wagyu, and whatnot, you can replicate to a degree or splice the actual embryo that's created as part of the reproduction process and fertility process. Embryo itself has developed technology that allows you to actually cut or splice an embryo multiple times over. Now, why is that important? Well, if you've got a high producing animal that produces either more butterfat, more lean mass, more lean protein, or any other sorts of particular traits you're looking for, embryo now has the ability to create progeny from that single embryo multiple times over. So you can actually create a superior herd. The tagline for the company is actually 7 years in 7 days, which means what they can do in a petri dish in 7 days. And I must make it clear, this is not genetic manipulation; it's gene splicing or embryo splicing.
What's the difference,
to create
Mark? Can
the
you
same?
tell us what the difference is?
So we're not modifying, or embryo aren't modifying the genes and creating a genetically modified animal. They're actually just able to create more twins of the same embryo. So there's no actual genetic modification taking place, which in itself can actually produce a whole bunch of different environmental challenges, which we've seen across the board with things like corn. So this is just being able to identify high producing progeny and embryos, and then being able to essentially splice or replicate them over, or cut them over and over. So from one embryo, you might end up with 4 or 5 genetic twins. Now that allows you to then have a superior herd, which might be able to produce either more milk, more butterfat, higher meat content, higher growth content, or importantly, Todd, animals that are more tolerant to various environmental conditions, which could include heat stress, water stress, or other. And so embryo is an interesting one. It was also recently invested in by the Gates Foundation. One of the reasons behind the Gates Foundation investing in an Australian and a Queensland-based animal genetics company is because whether you have a herd of 3 or 4 cattle in Sri Lanka or Indonesia, or 400 or 500 head in Australia, or 1,000 head in the US, you can now actually work with herds of all sizes to increase the yield and the efficiency of the herd, particularly in those small, more cottage industries and cottage geographies like Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, which increases the ability for the farmer to produce and make money, and also increases the yield of the food system. And so embryos are a very, very unique and very exciting company that's grown out of Australia and out of Queensland, that is looking to really tackle those protein systems and increase the efficiency of food systems in situ. So rather than having to ship food and food products around the world, actually being able to increase the efficiency of that protein production in situ. And that's very, very important moving forward.
So is it just the protein production that this assists? Or, for example, with herds in India, could it increase the milking ability of
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So Todd, any genetic trait that you're looking to actually identify, so whether it's an animal that produces more milk in a dairy herd, an animal that actually has a higher fat content, animals that might have a higher lean meat, lean muscle mass content, these are all the sorts of traits that you can start to naturally breed in and increase the efficiency of. So think of dairies that might have better buttermilk content, better fat content, higher protein within the milk. Wagyu that might have a higher marbling fat content within the animal, or just producing or having animals that actually produce more quickly, or become adult more quickly, so that you can actually increase the food production and the protein production. So it very much depends on the traits you're looking to actually to laser in on and then multiply. But that's what this sort of technology can do.
So that creates immediate food security for every, I guess, any end user of embryo.
That's right, and that was really one of the core reasons around the Gates Foundation also investing in, because if you think about the emerging middle class, and Todd, if you draw a line from Ho Chi Minh City down to Jakarta, there's almost 700 million people that represent the fastest growing middle class on the planet that have the highest requirements for nutrition, food, and protein systems. And so whether you have a small herd in any of those countries in Indonesia, the sort of technology that Embryo is creating allows for in situ food production, as well as increased nutrition and food systems for those ecosystems and those communities.
Todd, what I might just add is how we look at the underlying investment thesis, which underpins all of the investments we make through this fund, is through the lens of food security and how do we address that. And food security is a term which is probably used a lot more outside of Australia than it is within. Within COVID, we didn't really have a supply chain shock like the rest of the world. And I think it's only interesting to now see that we're using fuel security as a terminology. I think security is piece as a sovereignty that we all need to put more attention to. Yes, it does cost money as an investment, but unfortunately, we don't realize the impact of what we don't have until it's too late. The way that we look at food security is through two particular subcategories or angles. Firstly is through increasing nutrition from the current supply chain and food systems that we have today. And secondly is through more resilient supply. And this is how Embryo addresses all of these aspects, is because not only does it create more superior herds with species or specifications which is more desirable both to the customer, but also for climate adaptation, for resilience, for reduction of input intensity. The other side of it is to increase productivity on farm. And so the more efficient you can make the genetic evolution, the more superior herd, the stronger your resilience is as a food system. And that ultimately flows through to the cost of food that we all eat at our plate level. And so for us, looking at how do we optimize productivity and drive not only incremental, but also putting those bets in place for the material leaps in how do we drive food security, particularly through productivity, is a very particular skill of lens that we take in forming an underlying investment thesis for each of our investments.
That provides a lot of comfort for investors, I would imagine too, Tim.
I like to think that investing in food security and the future of our food systems through innovation not only allows us to make forward leaps and bounds as an industry, but also is timeless as an investment strategy. And so I like to view this as a evergreen, timeless, robust, sovereign strategy, more than just trying to ride the hypes of what is the next technology wave that is coming through the cycle.